Jacksonville, Florida, May 3, 2019. A thunderstorm, an ungrooved runway, a landing performance calculation that had been wrong since 2015. A Boeing 737 in a river, 143 survivors, several pets in the cargo hold that didn't make it. The FAA had already studied this exact scenario. Heavy rain, ungrooved surface, braking action 30 to 40% worse than the numbers predicted. They had written it up. They had sent the warning to every U.S. airline. Miami Air had it. 4 years passed. Nothing changed. What happens when the system generates the right warning and the airline does nothing? Here is what the final 60 seconds looked like. The aircraft is too high and too fast. 170 knots, where it should be 153. Above the glide path with a tailwind pushing it further. The ground proximity system fires. Sink rate, sink rate. The captain says, "I got it." The approach continues. Touchdown comes 1,580 feet into an 8,000-foot runway. The one working thrust reverser engages. The spoilers do not. They were never armed. The captain pushes the brakes to the floor. Nothing happens. The aircraft is hydroplaning. The tires are skimming across a thin film of water on a smooth, ungrooved surface. And the anti-skid system is actively reducing brake pressure to prevent wheel lockup. The harder the captain pushes, the less the brakes do. The runway end appears in the landing lights. At 80 knots, the 737 crosses the threshold, traverses 350 meters of grass, strikes a seawall at the edge of the St. Johns River, and goes in. All 143 people on board survive. The number that put them there, the braking action value used in the landing performance calculation, had been flagged as dangerously wrong by the FAA in 2015. Miami Air had received the warning. The procedures had never been updated. This is Miami Air Flight 293. Miami Air International was a U.S. charter airline operating a small fleet of Boeing 737s out of Miami. Its clients included corporate groups, sports teams, and the United States military, which had contracted Miami Air to run regular flights between the mainland and Naval Station Guantanamo Bay in Cuba. For the military personnel, families, civilian contractors, and legal professionals who traveled to and from that isolated base, these flights were the primary connection to the outside world. May 3, 2019 was supposed to be straightforward. Fly from Naval Air Station Jacksonville to Guantanamo, pick up passengers, return to Jacksonville, continue to Norfolk. 3 legs, 1 crew, 1 day. Nothing about it would be straightforward. The captain was 55, with approximately 7,500 total flight hours, including 2,200 on the Boeing 737. He had rebuilt his qualifications from scratch after relocating from Argentina mid-career, and had risen to become a ground and simulator instructor, a line check airman, and an FAA-designated examiner authorized to conduct pilot certificate examinations. Experienced and trusted. His first officer was 47, also from Argentina, also with roughly 7,500 total hours. But those hours had been accumulated almost entirely on small aircraft and as a freelance flight instructor. The 737 was the first jet he had ever flown. On this day, he had logged exactly 18 hours on type, still in his initial operating experience under the captain's supervision. The day began going wrong before it started. Pre-flight checks revealed the left thrust reverser fault light illuminated. A mechanic could not clear it. The reverser was logged inoperative per the minimum equipment list, and the flight proceeded on 1. They had not left the ramp before the next problem. Both air conditioning bleed air systems lost pressure simultaneously during taxi. Without bleed air, normal pressurization and cabin temperature control were unavailable. The crew returned, mechanics could not fix it, and the captain followed the minimum equipment list procedure, using the auxiliary power unit to supply 1 air conditioning pack in flight. The APU could only provide bleed air up to 17,000 feet, so the crew refiled their flight plan at that restricted altitude, recalculated fuel, and started over. They departed 4 hours behind schedule on a broken aircraft, at a ceiling that would put them directly in the path of Florida's evening thunderstorms. Before the flight had even left, a dispatcher at Miami Air had calculated the landing performance for the return leg into Jacksonville. The inputs were standard: runway length, aircraft weight, approach speed, wind, the inoperative reverser, and a braking action value of 5, corresponding to good, to account for possible wet runway on arrival. That value, good braking action on a wet runway, was Miami Air policy. It was also, under the conditions developing over Jacksonville that night, significantly more optimistic than the runway would allow. In 2015, the FAA had published a safety alert for operators identifying a documented pattern. On wet, ungrooved runways during or after heavy rain, actual braking performance was consistently 30 to 40% worse than the standard good assumption. The recommendation was explicit: assume medium braking action at best in these conditions, not good. The difference was significant enough to push calculated stopping distances beyond available runway length in scenarios exactly like the one developing over Jacksonville. Miami Air had received the 2015 alert. The airline had not updated its procedures. 4 years later, its dispatchers were still using good. The number in the paperwork said the runway was long enough. The runway that night would say otherwise. To understand why that braking action number mattered so much, you need to understand what happens to a runway surface during extreme rainfall, and why the difference between a grooved and an ungrooved surface is not a minor technical detail. A grooved runway has channels cut into the pavement, running perpendicular to the direction of travel. When rain falls, these grooves channel water toward the edges of the runway, preventing it from pooling in the center, where the tires need to contact the surface. On a grooved runway, even in heavy rain, the tires can usually find dry or near-dry pavement and generate meaningful friction. An ungrooved runway has no such channels. Water spreads evenly across the surface and accumulates. In moderate rain, this is manageable, but in extreme rainfall, the kind that thunderstorms produce, water can build up faster than it can drain away. The result is a runway covered with a thin, continuous layer of standing water. And a thin layer of water on a smooth surface is all that viscous hydroplaning needs. Most people are familiar with dynamic hydroplaning, the phenomenon where tires are literally lifted off a flooded surface by the force of water pressure at high speed. Viscous hydroplaning is different. It does not require a flooded surface. It does not require extremely high speed. It requires only a thin film of water and a smooth runway texture, which together act as a lubricant between the tire and the pavement. The tire never fully loses contact with the ground, but the friction it generates drops to near zero. Brakes become almost ineffective. Anti-skid systems, designed to prevent wheel lockup, respond by reducing brake pressure because the wheels are on the verge of skidding even under light braking. The harder the pilot pushes the brake pedals, the more aggressively the anti-skid reduces pressure. This is exactly what the FAA's 2015 safety alert had warned about. Not a theoretical risk, a documented pattern from real accidents, on real runways, in real thunderstorms. Runway 1028 at Naval Air Station Jacksonville was ungrooved. The thunderstorm over Jacksonville that night was producing rainfall at a rate of over 6 centimeters per hour. Calculations later showed that at that precipitation rate, on that ungrooved surface, the water depth on the runway during Flight 293's approach was approaching 3 millimeters, the threshold between a wet runway and a flooded one. Not quite flooded, but more than wet enough for viscous hydroplaning. Had Miami Air incorporated the 2015 FAA safety alert, the dispatcher would have used a braking action value of medium, not good, in the landing performance calculation. With that assumption, the calculated stopping distance for a 737 with one inoperative thrust reverser, a tailwind, and a wet, ungrooved runway would have exceeded the available runway length. The system would have flagged the landing as unsafe before the aircraft even left Guantanamo. The crew would have been required to hold for the storm to clear or divert. But the dispatcher used good. The number said safe, and the flight continued. In the cabin, 136 passengers, military personnel, their families, contractors, legal professionals returning from Guantanamo, settled in for the 2-hour flight north. The single air conditioning pack running off the APU was struggling against the Caribbean heat, and the cabin was uncomfortable. Passengers and crew were sweating. The aircraft was 4 hours behind schedule, and everyone on board simply wanted to get home. As Flight 293 climbed to its restricted cruise altitude of 17,000 feet and turned northwest toward Florida. The crew reviewed the weather. Conditions along the route were mostly clear, but thunderstorms were forecast near Jacksonville. The captain noted this, briefed the first officer, and decided that he would take the controls himself for the approach and landing, given the expected weather and the first officer's limited experience. 18 hours on type. This was only his second day of line flying after base training. 30 minutes from Jacksonville, the thunderstorms began rising directly in their path. The crew requested weather deviations around the cells, and the captain contacted Miami Air Dispatch for updated weather at the destination. The report showed winds from 120 degrees at 4 knots, visibility 10 miles, cumulonimbus to the south and west, manageable. The captain briefed the first officer for a GPS approach to runway 10, a runway that would give them a slight headwind. Then the controller came back. At 9:22 p.m., on descent through 13,000 feet, Jacksonville approach informed the crew that the wind had shifted, now from 350 degrees, and that there was moderate to heavy precipitation on the final approach course for runway 28, the reciprocal runway. The captain asked about runway 10 instead. The controller reported precipitation building there too, starting about 5 miles from the airport. What followed was a series of runway changes, driven by a storm that was moving faster than the briefings could keep up with. Runway 28, then back to runway 10, then 28 again, then back to 10. Each change required a new approach setup, a new briefing, and additional workload on a crew that was already 4 hours behind schedule, tired, and operating with a first officer who was still learning the aircraft. By the time they were established on final for runway 10, the crew had rebriefed the approach multiple times. The captain was hand flying. The first officer was managing the flight management system and working through the landing checklist. There were 3 things that needed to happen before landing that did not happen. The first was a landing performance recalculation. Miami Air's own procedures required pilots to recalculate their landing distance using the onboard performance tool if conditions had changed unfavorably from the dispatcher's original calculation. Specifically, a recalculation was mandatory if the tailwind exceeded 5 knots. At 9:39 p.m., the Navy tower reported the wind had shifted again, now from 240 degrees at 10 knots, giving Flight 293 a 7-knot tailwind component on runway 10. That was above the threshold. A recalculation was required. It was never done. And even if it had been, even if the captain had pulled up the onboard performance tool and entered every updated variable, the answer the system returned would still have been based on good braking action. Miami Air's procedures said good on a wet runway. The tool would have confirmed that the runway was long enough. The wrong assumption would have produced the wrong answer, even from a correctly executed recalculation. The second thing that did not happen was a proper speed brake check. As the first officer worked through the landing checklist, he called out speed brakes armed. He did not physically verify that the speed brake lever was in the armed position. In aviation, this practice, reading a checklist item without actually checking the corresponding system, is called rhyming the checklist. It is more common than most pilots would like to admit, particularly under high workload, and particularly with inexperienced pilots in unfamiliar aircraft. The captain, focused on hand flying through the storm, did not cross-check the item either. Speed brakes, also called spoilers, deploy automatically on touchdown when armed, collapsing the lift generated by the wings and driving the aircraft's weight down onto its wheels. That weight transfer is what makes the brakes effective. Without spoiler deployment, the aircraft effectively lands light. The wheels are not fully loaded, and braking friction is reduced significantly. The speed brakes were not armed. The third thing that did not happen was a go-around. By 1,000 feet above the runway, the stabilized approach gate where airlines require all approach criteria to be confirmed before continuing, Flight 293 was not stable. The captain was chasing the glide path from above, pushing the nose down to regain the descent profile. The tailwind was accelerating the aircraft. The speed climbed through 170 knots, 17 knots above the target. The PAPI lights alongside the runway, a visual guidance system that shows 4 white lights when the aircraft is too high and 4 red lights when too low, were showing 4 white. The approach was clearly and definitively unstabilized. Neither pilot called it out. The captain said nothing. The first officer said nothing. The stabilized approach concept exists for one reason. An aircraft that arrives at the runway threshold too fast, too high, or misaligned has already consumed the margins that are supposed to protect against everything that can go wrong in the next 30 seconds. Remove those margins, and the runway that was calculated as long enough may not be. At 500 feet, the aircraft began drifting sharply to the right. The captain corrected. Seconds later, the ground proximity warning system fired. Sink rate. Sink rate. The captain said, "I got it. I got it." The aircraft crossed the runway threshold at 120 feet, more than twice the normal value, descending rapidly at 170 knots, with a tailwind of roughly 10 knots. The captain aimed for the touchdown zone. He missed it by 80 feet, touching down 1,580 feet into the runway. The runway was 8,000 feet long. That left 6,420 feet to stop. Under normal conditions, with full braking, working reversers, and deployed spoilers, a 737 would stop well within that distance. These were not normal conditions. 9:42 p.m. Touchdown. The captain deploys the single working thrust reverser. The auto brakes engage. The spoilers do not move, because they were never armed. 3 seconds pass. The aircraft travels 500 feet at 180 knots ground speed. Then a safety system detects the anomaly. Aircraft on ground, wheels spinning, reverser deployed, no spoilers. It overrides the unarmed state and deploys them automatically. But 500 feet of runway are already gone. The captain pushes the brakes harder. The aircraft is not slowing down. He pushes harder still. Nothing happens. To understand why, you need to understand what the anti-skid system is doing. On a dry runway, brake pressure causes friction between the tire and the pavement, which slows the wheel's rotation. The anti-skid system monitors wheel speed and reduces brake pressure if it detects the wheel decelerating too fast, a sign it is about to lock up and skid. But on this runway, there is almost no friction to begin with. The tires are riding on a thin film of water over smooth pavement, viscous hydroplaning. The wheels are barely gripping the surface. Even under light braking, they are on the verge of skidding. The anti-skid system reads this as impending wheel lockup and reduces brake pressure. The captain pushes harder. The anti-skid reduces further. The aircraft continues at nearly full speed. The one working thrust reverser is pulling asymmetrically, dragging the nose to the right. The captain corrects with the rudder. The aircraft yaws left, then right, then left again, oscillating across the runway center line as he fights both the directional pull and the useless brakes simultaneously. The runway end lights appear in the windscreen. The crew begins to shout. At 9:42 and 10 seconds, Flight 293 crosses the runway end threshold at approximately 80 knots, about 150 kilometers per hour. The aircraft continues across 350 meters of grass beyond the runway, strikes the seawall at the edge of the St. Johns River, and the impact tears the landing gear away. The 737 pitches forward over the wall and into the river, slamming into the shallow, muddy bottom, before coming to rest a few meters from the bank. Inside the cabin, the impact throws passengers forward against their seatbelts. Overhead bins open, items fall, the cabin lights go out. The river water, St. Johns River, is only a few feet deep at that location, does not rise above the cabin floor except at the very last rows. The flight attendants do not wait for instructions. In the darkness and the noise, all four begin moving through the cabin simultaneously, checking for injuries, directing passengers toward exits, inflating life rafts. The captain completes a full sweep of the cabin to check for anyone incapacitated before becoming the last person to leave the aircraft. All 143 people on board walk out. In the cargo hold below the waterline, several pets that had been loaded in carriers drown before crew members and first responders can reach them. Every attempt is made. It is not enough. On the riverbank, passengers stand in the warm Florida night in wet clothes, watching the tail of their aircraft protruding from the water of the St. Johns River. Emergency vehicles arrive within minutes. The evacuation is complete before most of the responding units reach the scene. The National Transportation Safety Board investigation took nearly 2 years. What it produced was not a simple narrative of pilot error. It was a layered accounting of decisions made at multiple levels, in the cockpit, in the dispatch office, and in the years before the flight when warnings had arrived and been set aside. The NTSB's primary finding was technical. The accident was caused by an extreme loss of braking friction due to water accumulation on the ungrooved runway surface, resulting in viscous hydroplaning. The crew's actions, the unstabilized approach, the unarmed spoilers, the failure to recalculate landing performance, were noted as factors that increased the severity of the outcome. But the board concluded that even a perfectly executed approach and landing, flown to the letter of every procedure, would not have stopped the aircraft within the available runway. The braking conditions that night made the overrun inevitable from the moment the crew decided to land. That conclusion pointed directly at the braking action assumption. Investigators confirmed what the 2015 FAA safety alert had already identified, that on ungrooved runways and heavy rain, actual braking performance was consistently and significantly worse than the standard good assumption predicted. The FAA had quantified this, published it, and distributed it to every U.S. airline. The safety alert was explicit about what operators should do: update their procedures to assume medium braking action, not good, in heavy rain on wet, ungrooved surfaces. Miami Air had received the alert. 4 years later, its dispatchers were still using good. Its pilots were never trained on the difference. The onboard performance tool used good as its wet runway default. From the moment the dispatcher ran the landing performance calculation for Flight 293, the numbers had been based on an assumption the FAA had flagged as wrong. This was not a case of pilots overriding a warning system or ignoring an alarm. The warning had been issued to airline management. The update had never reached the cockpit. In the wider investigation of Miami Air's operations, the NTSB noted concerns about the airline's safety culture that the final report did not fully develop. The pattern of deferred maintenance on a single aircraft, an inoperative thrust reverser, 2 inoperative bleed air systems, a restricted cruise altitude, all on the same day, was noted. The apparent lack of enforcement of the stabilized approach concept was noted. Neither pilot indicated in post-accident interviews that they had recognized anything abnormal about the approach, a statement investigators found difficult to reconcile with the flight data. In Guantanamo Bay, families who had boarded the aircraft that evening, some returning from months at the base, some traveling with children, some who had made this flight many times before, found themselves standing wet on a riverbank in the Florida night. In the days that followed, passengers described the evacuation in terms of calm and professionalism. The flight attendants had moved through the darkened cabin without hesitation. Several passengers credited the crew's immediate response with preventing serious injuries. The pets in the cargo hold had no such advocate in the final seconds. In the months following the accident, the FAA issued a new safety alert, superseding the 2015 one. The updated guidance expanded the conditions under which airlines were required to use more conservative braking action assumptions, now specifying that moderate to heavy rain on an ungrooved runway should prompt dispatchers and pilots to treat the surface as contaminated, not merely wet. A contaminated runway required stopping distances calculated with friction values that more accurately reflected what tires actually do on a waterlogged, smooth surface in a thunderstorm. This was not a new discovery. The physics had not changed. What changed was the language, from a recommendation airlines could choose to ignore to a directive that closed the gap between what the FAA knew and what the industry was required to apply. Miami Air implemented a long list of operational and training changes, revised adverse runway procedures, updated braking action assumptions, additional training on the non-negotiable nature of the stabilized approach concept, and specific instruction on the difference between reading a checklist item and verifying the actual system state. Speed brakes armed means nothing if the lever has not been physically confirmed. Miami Air ceased operations in 2020, grounded by the pandemic before most of those changes could be embedded in routine operations. The lessons did not travel far within the airline that generated them. But the FAA's updated alert did travel. Airlines across the United States reviewed their braking action assumptions, their wet runway procedures, and their dispatcher training. The specific combination present on May 3rd, ungrooved surface, extreme rainfall, good assumption, became a named scenario in safety curricula rather than a gap waiting to be discovered. The dispatch paperwork for Flight 293 had shown the runway as long enough. Under the assumptions Miami Air was using in 2019, it was. Under the assumptions the FAA had been urging since 2015, it was not. That gap, between the number on the page and the friction available on the pavement, is where 143 people ended up in a river. The next time a crew considers landing through a thunderstorm onto a runway they cannot fully assess, the question is not whether the number says safe. The question is what assumption the number was built on, and whether anyone in the chain between the FAA and the cockpit ever stopped to check. If you want to understand how aviation safety advances, not through dramatic changes, but through the slow closing of gaps between what is known and what is practiced, stay with this channel. The next one is already waiting.